We're with Ray Weil in Pennsylvania on Steve Groff's farm in a soils pit, and it's really a pleasure to meet you, Ray.
Thanks.
We appreciate the time. I know you've got lots of other things going on.
Well, I can't think of any place I'd rather be than in a soils pit on Steve Groff's farm, so
Well,
that's good.
Tell us about what you want to talk to farmers about today in the soils pit.
Well, you can see this is a deep soils pit. It's at least 6 feet deep.
Yep.
I'm only 5.5 feet myself, but you're probably pushing 6. And so the focus of this pit is depth. Soils are a three-dimensional body in the critical zone, and they go on down into the water table, and it's really, most soils are quite deep. And farmers and even soil scientists, except for pedologists, because pedologists classify soils mostly on what's going on down here. They don't pay much attention to the surface, but farmers pay almost all their attention to just the surface soil. In the old days, the soil that they plowed. I hate to say plowed because I'm kind of a big advocate for no-till, but still that plow layer, that surface layer. And they don't think about what goes on below. So even if they're digging up some roots or pulling up some roots, they're usually getting, from the top 6-10 inches of soil, and that's where their mind is. When we apply lime and fertilizer, we make all the calculations based on that. And so I'm trying to get farmers to start thinking a little bit deeper, because there's a lot that goes on deeper, and there's a big resources that they need to use. One of the big things, we're standing in front of some radish cover crops. This is a daikon type radish that Steve Groff had branded his particular selections as the Tillage radish, and he got that name because of the work that I did early with him that showed that this would alleviate soil compaction, so the damage done by driving on the soil with heavy equipment and plowing could be alleviated by this root, which is able to push down through and access this huge, deep, in some sense, a huge tank of water and nutrients, especially water in the summer. So, if this is compacted and the topsoil, which is amended with fertilizer, has all the nutrients up here, but the water holding capacity is going to be mostly down here. That's a matter of volume. And if this is separated by a compacted zone, as most farm soils are, then you're really kind of growing your crops in a flower pot.
Yeah. Okay.
And when summer comes along and that flower pot, the water is used up, the roots need to get down here to pull water up, and they'll start going deeper and deeper to get water. But if there's a barrier, you're going to be limiting your yields and your production. And you can see that very dramatically sometimes, where you had a cover crop and where you didn't, because the cover crop is growing now in fall, and this soil is all moist. We're in the East Coast in a humid region, and in that kind of region, whenever you dig a hole, eventually you're going to get moist soil, even in the summer. Now, if you're in Kansas or in dry parts of the world, if you dig a hole deep enough, you'll hit dry soil, even if it's moist at the surface, because you don't have this excess rainfall, but we do. And so we know there's moisture down there. Can the crops reach it? So one of the important things is being able to develop a soil structure in a kind of a permanent way that will allow this. And the traditional way to do this is with very big tractors pulling large shanks of steel through the soil, trying to go about this deep and break up the plow pan that might exist. That sometimes actually determines how big a tractor a farmer needs to buy. So if you have to buy a bigger tractor to do that, that's what determines it becomes a very expensive, fuel-intensive, time-intensive operation, and we can let nature do it. Okay. Because the key is the soil is soft when it's wet and hard when it's dry. And so in the fall, when there's not much evapotranspiration, the soils are staying moist. We've got these cover crops growing through. Under these conditions, they can push through. You can see these roots pushing on through. And they will make superhighways that the crop roots next summer, when it's dry and hard, will find these holes in these superhighways, and some that you can see, some of them are too small to see, and they'll be able to access this huge storage tank of water and also nutrients. So that's one really important aspect, that just to get the farmers to realize there's more to the plant and to the soil than the top 6 or 10 inches. We really want to connect that.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because everything is calculated on that 6-inch plow pan, and you don't realize how much of a resource is below. So that makes a whole lot of sense.
I think that's really true. The mindset is sort of just focusing on what you see at the surface because, let's face it, we're above ground creatures.
Right.
We're really not very comfortable thinking about, what's going on in the soil. Our senses don't work down there too well,
And you're also saying is that once you break that compaction layer, that plow pan, then you have a lot more access to what's below
Yes.
there.
And it's a permanent thing. So these,
Yep.
in fact, what you see is it gets reinforced over time. So Steve has been no-tilling for a long time.
Yes.
Since he took over the farm back, a lot of these fields now for 30 years or so. And so if you're doing tillage, these channels that are made by earthworms and by roots will be disturbed and you have to start over every year. But without tillage, either the earthworms will make these channels, and we dug an earthworm up a few minutes ago. They're hiding because this is the edge of the pit, but they're down in there. If we dig in there, we'll find them. So they'll make a channel and they'll exude some organic materials and their slime coatings that they have. And they'll make it a very attractive place for a root to be. It's moist, it's easy to push through, it's got nutrients. So the roots will start growing there, often in bundles of roots.
Yes.
I think this might, it's just one. Sometimes you get, if it's the only place where roots can grow, you may get several roots coming down through the same hole, like here. And so the roots will then decay and add more organic matter nutrients to that. So every year that hole gets sort of more enriched and more entrenched as a pathway, and you get more and more of these pathways, and they don't disappear from year to year.
One of the things you were talking about also was this deep nitrate work that
Yes.
you're doing at the moment. Certainly what we've seen, for instance, I've been working with farmers in South Carolina where they have always thought that I've got 60 or 90 pounds or 120 pounds per acre of potassium in my top 6 inches, and we went down 6, 12, 18, 24, and they had at each layer about the same amount.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like the deep nitrate work that you're doing is kind of similar. Is that correct?
It's similar in the sense that we're finding a lot all the way through the profile.
Right.
Potassium, of course, is different because potassium is coming from the rock. So where you
Okay.
see these rocks weathering,
Yes.
and you have some similar things in North Carolina, that's creating soluble potassium as
Okay.
those rocks weather. The
Okay.
nitrogen is more biological.
Yes.
It initially comes from either fertilizer or manure or from the air, from legumes, and it's
Yes.
being added at the top. So the
Correct.
potassium is actually being added at the bottom
Okay.
and throughout the soil, except for fertilizer additions at the top, whereas the nitrogen is coming in at the top almost entirely. And again, we usually make our measurements up here, and we think about what we have, and we know the crop removes so much. And what we're finding is that what really opened my eyes was doing the cover crop work on farms like Steve's. And you find this on almost any farm that was a dairy farm sometime in past history, so that it had manure and it had pastures and it had legumes growing on it, even if it was 50 years ago. Those farms have built up organic matter that keeps mineralizing and releasing nitrogen. And so farmers are taking off 25 tons, 30 tons of corn silage, dry matter, with several hundred pounds of nitrogen in it. And then you plant a cover crop after that, and lo and behold, it grows like this. And you measure the content of nitrogen, and it's got another 200 pounds of nitrogen in it. And that was soluble nitrogen that was left over after the corn was harvested. Well, the corn is not very good at getting the nitrogen that's very deep.
Right.
And we're finding that this kind of cover crop will clean the profile up down as deep as we've measured. And we've gone to about 7.5 feet, 2 meters deep. And when we look that far, it's cleaned it up down there. And when you
By
make
cleaning it
measurements,
up, it's taking nitrate out.
that virtually under the cover crop you find close to zero nitrate.
Okay.
You can hardly measure it. Without the cover crop, you might find, 5 or 10 or 15 parts per million. And when you add that up, 10 parts per million is 20 pounds per acre in a 6-inch slice. So you start adding up 6-inch slices over 6 feet. That's 12 slices. 12 slices times, even if it's only 10 pounds per slice, is another 120 pounds of nitrogen that you didn't know you had. You thought you cleaned everything up. That nitrogen is going to be gone during the winter. Because during the winter, there's no water leaving the top. There's no evaporation. We just have water moving through, especially if it's a mild, when the soil's not frozen. So during the the fall and winter and early spring months is when the leaching takes place, and that water is then on its way. Once it gets down into the rock and into the groundwater, it's on its way to, in our case, the Chesapeake Bay, which is hundreds of miles away, but we're in the watershed. And we know it's getting loaded, and this is why it's getting loaded.
Right.
So this is an amazing waste. Goodness.
Yeah.
60 cents a pound, and you've got 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre that the cover crop is catching that you would otherwise have lost, and you didn't even know you had, because if you measure in the surface, it might be low.
Yeah.
Corn may have cleaned it up. So this is a real revelation. It was a revelation to me, and when I talk to farmers about that, you know, you just do the math, and they can see, well, this is not to my benefit. And of course, it's also not to everybody else's benefit in terms of water quality.